The glass walls of the luxury airport lounge shimmered under the golden hue of a Doha sunset, casting long reflections onto the marble floor. Ice clinked quietly in crystal tumblers. Businessmen in tailored suits murmured into Bluetooth headsets. In the corner, a woman sat unnoticed. Eleanor Grace held a paperback in one hand and a cup of chamomile tea in the other. Her silver hair was swept into a simple twist, revealing the delicate curve of her neck and the vintage wristwatch hugging her wrist, a soft engraving visible only in the right light, "Amelia, my sky forever." Her clothes were modest. A dove-gray cardigan, soft slacks, and a sweatshirt that looked out of place in this room. It was the sweatshirt that drew the first insult. "Do you think she got lost on her way to economy?" a young executive whispered too loudly. Across the lounge, laughter flared like a spark to dry kindling. Eleanor's eyes didn't rise from her book. But her fingers tightened. Not much. Just enough. A steward approached. "Madam, boarding will begin shortly. Would you like to proceed with pre-boarding?" Before Eleanor could speak, a tall man with slick hair stepped forward. He smelled of cologne and old money. "You're calling her for pre-boarding? Surely you mean priority access for business class." The steward cleared his throat. "No, sir. She is in Suite 1. Suite 1. The words echoed and fractured in the air. The man's laughter faltered. "You're joking." Eleanor simply stood, nodded, and walked past him with quiet grace. As she passed, her sweatshirt swayed, a simple row of embroidered penguins, their tiny wings frozen mid-flap. One penguin had a golden star stitched into its chest. The steward opened the velvet rope, and Eleanor disappeared down the jet bridge, leaving behind a silence thicker than judgment. But they didn't know. She wasn't just a woman in a penguin sweatshirt. She sat near the window, her gaze fixed beyond the tarmac where heat shimmered like a mirage. Inside the luxurious lounge, everything gleamed: crystal glasses, polished marble floors, the soft golden glow of ambient lighting. Yet Eleanor Grace, in her quiet corner with a faded scarf wrapped gently around her neck, looked utterly out of place. A server passed by offering champagne. She declined with a small shake of her head and returned to staring at the sky, as if searching for someone lost in the clouds. Outside, planes rose and dipped in rhythm. Inside her chest, a silence pressed tighter. She took out the vintage watch from her coat pocket, not to check the time, but to trace the name engraved underneath: Clara Grace, always with you. The moment her fingers found the etching, her shoulders dropped slightly. The watch was too delicate to wear now. But it remained her compass. 10 years had passed. 10 whole years since Clara's last breath, since Eleanor's voice shattered inside a sterile hospital room in London. No final words, no goodbye, just that one long beep that rewrote her world. Since then, Eleanor moved like a shadow in the sunlight, always present but never seen. She had once been someone else. Sharp, proud, commanding boardrooms without ever raising her voice. Back then, her name carried weight. Investors listened. Pilots nodded in respect. She and Richard had built it all from scratch, welding dreams to steel wings, founding an airline that stood for legacy and love. They named it Sky Clara. But after Clara died, Eleanor faded. Now, here she was, mistaken for a lost old woman by flight attendants half her age, pitted by executives too arrogant to imagine her relevance. Earlier that morning, the young receptionist had tried politely to redirect her to the economy check-in. "Madam, this area is for business class and elite members only," he'd whispered, eyeing her worn coat. She hadn't corrected him. What would be the point? In her mind, she heard Clara's laughter. "You never dress for the world you built, Mum," she'd once teased, tugging at Eleanor's beige sweater. "But maybe that's your power." Eleanor smiled faintly at the memory. Then it disappeared. Across the lounge, conversations buzzed, deals made, stocks discussed, lives measured by digits. One group debated airline acquisitions, tossing around names with bravado. Sky Clara only survived because of government bailout, one man snorted. Their branding is so outdated. Eleanor flinched as if slapped. Not because he was wrong, but because that brand, her daughter's name, was never meant to sell anything. It had been a promise, a vow carved into aluminum and flight paths. For years, she had refused interviews, declined photo ops, turned down speaking panels. Richard had taken the public stage. She remained the architect behind the curtain. But now that he was gone too, only the silence remained. The company still soared, but without anyone knowing whose wings held it up. She closed her eyes, forcing her breath to slow. The scarf shifted slightly, revealing a silver chain. She tucked it back quickly. No one needed to see the locket. No one ever had, except Clara. Then she heard it again. Laughter. Sharp, derisive. This time directed at her. Two younger women, impeccably dressed, stood by the espresso machine. One of them nodded toward Eleanor and said something under her breath. The other laughed. It wasn't cruel, not directly. But Eleanor had lived long enough to recognize the sound of dismissal. She stood slowly, her knees aching as always. Walked past them with quiet grace, without a glance. She didn't need to prove anything. Still, it stung. Not the insult, but the invisibility. She reached the flight gate early, not because of anxiety but because waiting alone had become a habit. A gate agent offered to help her find her seat. She declined gently. I know the way, she said with a voice that had once directed the construction of entire terminals. They never see it, she thought. They never imagined someone like me could have created the very ground they walk on. She found her seat and sank into it, alone with her thoughts. Above her, the reading light flickered. She didn't reach for it. Darkness suited her. Then, a voice on the intercom. A soft announcement. Welcome to Sky Clara Flight 728, en route from Doha to Paris. The name hit her like a wave. Most people didn't even hear it anymore. But for her, it was a chime rung at the heart. Across the aisle, a young boy clutched a plush penguin. He looked afraid of flying. Eleanor smiled gently and leaned closer. Penguins don't fear the sky, she whispered. The boy blinked, surprised. They don't fly. Not the way we think, she replied. But they're born to move through resistance. He smiled. She turned away, tears warming her eyes. For a moment, she remembered who she was. And she knew what was coming. In a few minutes, the gate would close. The business class cabin would fill. And someone, inevitably, would question why she belonged there. They always did. But today, she would not shrink. Today, she would let them wonder. Because even grief, when carried long enough, becomes quiet strength. The plane glided above soft clouds like a quiet giant, its wings slicing through the golden horizon of dusk. In the business class cabin, a hush had settled, soft clinks of cutlery, the murmur of idle conversation, pages of newspapers turning like whispers. Eleanor remained still, her hands folded in her lap, the window framing a sea of fading sunlight. But someone was watching her. 2 rows behind, a middle-aged flight attendant paused longer than usual while serving. Her name tag read Inez. She carried herself with the poised grace of someone who had seen 100 faces a day for 20 years, and remembered everyone that mattered. She set down a tray gently in front of a passenger, but her eyes kept drifting toward Eleanor. Something about the woman's stillness, her posture, that scarf, especially that scarf, was gnawing at her memory. A vague feeling tugged at her chest, like catching the scent of an old perfume on the wind. She returned to the galley and whispered to her colleague, the woman in 3A, do you recognize her? Looks like someone's grandmother, the other steward chuckled. Probably upgraded last minute. Why? Inez didn't answer. She peeked through the curtain again. Eleanor sat quietly, sipping water, her face turned slightly away. Then Inez saw it. The silver locket peeking from beneath the scarf. Small, oval, with a delicate engraving along the edges. It caught the cabin light just long enough for her to remember. 10 years ago, during a memorial flight for the daughter of Sky Clara's founders, Inez had worked the private family cabin. She had handed tissues to a woman who hadn't spoken a word the entire journey, only clutched a tiny silver locket with trembling hands. She had worn that same scarf then, faded blue with faint ivory trim. It had smelled of lavender. That wasn't just any passenger. That was Eleanor Grace. But she had disappeared after Richard passed. Rumor among the senior crew said she'd stepped away from the board. She hadn't flown commercial in years. Most assumed she'd moved to Switzerland. Or Italy. Or maybe just vanished into her grief. Inez pulled out her phone discreetly and scrolled through the archived employee newsletter. Each issue had a founder's note. She opened one dated years ago and zoomed into the small photograph, Eleanor Grace standing beside a hangar with her husband and a young girl. The girl had Clara's eyes. Now Inez was sure. She returned to the aisle, this time slower. Not to serve, but to look. As she passed Eleanor's row, she dropped a folded napkin onto the tray and gave a soft nod. Eleanor looked up, puzzled. She unfolded the napkin. Inside, scribbled in careful handwriting were 4 words, "I remember Clara too." Eleanor's breath caught. Her eyes flicked up toward the galley, where Inez stood now, hands clasped before her, eyes gentle, waiting for nothing in return. Eleanor pressed the napkin to her lips. The scarf tightened slightly at her throat as if wrapping her in her daughter's arms. She blinked hard and looked away. Inez disappeared behind the curtain. Across the aisle, a suited man observed the exchange. Young, maybe mid-30s. He leaned slightly into the aisle to see better. His name was Julian Hart, an independent reporter flying to Paris for a feature on aviation innovation. But what caught his eye wasn't the interaction, it was the name, Clara, and the way Eleanor had reacted. Julian knew the airline's founding myth well. He'd researched it years ago, back when Sky Clara turned from a struggling regional operator to a symbol of legacy. The company claimed their first fleet bore the name Clara in honor of the founder's daughter. But official photos of the family were rare, and Eleanor Grace had vanished from all public records since 2015. He tapped a note into his phone, 3A. Elder woman. Penguin scarf. Possibly Eleanor Grace. He couldn't be sure, of course. But something told him this wasn't a coincidence. Back in seat 3A, Eleanor reopened the locket. Inside was a photograph, faded but cherished. A girl in ballet shoes. And next to her, a younger version of Eleanor, smiling as if life hadn't yet broken her heart. The locket clicked shut. She looked around the cabin. No one else seemed to know. No one else seemed to care. That was comforting, and lonely. She could have stayed hidden forever. But something about that napkin, that flight, that boy earlier with the plush penguin, it all stirred something in her chest. Something that hadn't moved in years. She wasn't invisible anymore. Not entirely. And someone remembered Clara. That was enough, for now. The lights dimmed slightly as the plane began its gentle descent toward Charles de Gaulle. A golden hue poured through the oval windows, casting warm halos across the cabin. Eleanor stared out, not seeing the city below, but a memory. It was the last time Clara had flown. The little girl had insisted on sitting by the window, her face pressed to the glass as she pointed at the clouds and whispered, "They look like castles, Mama." Eleanor had smiled then, unaware it would be the last flight they'd take together. Grief came in waves. Some days it was a fog. Other days, like now, it came sharp as a blade, uninvited. A rustle to her right pulled her back to the present. The flight crew was making their final sweep, offering warm towels and collecting stray glasses. The young man from across the aisle, Julian, leaned toward her politely. "Pardon me," he said softly, "I couldn't help but notice your pendant earlier." "The engraving. Clara?" She didn't answer at first. He added quickly, "Forgive me. It's just, I've studied the history of Sky Clara. And the founder's daughter, I mean." Eleanor turned slowly. Her eyes met his. Calm, unwavering. "She loved the clouds," she said. "Even more than I did." Julian's breath caught. "You are Eleanor Grace." A hush fell between them, though few around noticed. She nodded once. No flourish. No defense. "I thought you disappeared," Julian whispered. "I did," she said. "And now I'm just, returning. One flight at a time." From the galley, Inez watched everything unfold. She had alerted the captain after recognizing Eleanor. And now, the consequence of that small act of remembrance was unraveling faster than expected. The intercom crackled, breaking the quiet. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice was steady but tinged with something else, reverence. "We'd like to thank a very special passenger on board today. One of Sky Clara's co-founders and the soul behind its name, Eleanor Grace. Ma'am, welcome home." A ripple passed through the cabin. Eleanor sat motionless. Across from her, Julian's eyes widened. Behind her, a young couple sat up straighter. 3 rows down, a woman gasped and whispered, "Is that really her?" The man in the beige suit who had earlier refused to give up his overhead bin space now shifted uncomfortably. A little boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, asking if the airplane lady was famous. But none of it mattered to Eleanor. What mattered was that voice. That gentle acknowledgement from the cockpit. Someone still remembered. Someone cared. The passenger in the front row, an executive in a sleek gray suit, rose quickly. He approached, extending his hand with a rehearsed smile. "Miss Grace, what an absolute honor. On behalf of Sterling Partners, we'd love to speak with you about a legacy partnership." Eleanor looked at his hand. Then at his name tag, Sterling. One of the same firms that had once tried to buy out the airline during its darkest year. She offered a small smile. "Some legacies can't be bought." He chuckled awkwardly. Of course. But we admire your vision." From the intercom again, "Cabin crew, prepare for landing." Eleanor fastened her seatbelt. Her hands were steady now. Beside her, Julian sat wide-eyed. "May I write about this?" he asked. Eleanor didn't answer immediately. She looked toward Inez, who gave a slight nod of encouragement. Then, quietly, Eleanor replied, "If you tell the story truthfully, not of a brand, but of a mother." Julian's voice cracked a little. "Yes. I promise." The plane began its slow descent through cotton skies. Across the aisle, a passenger fumbled to retrieve his phone, trying to snap a discreet photo. Inez was there in seconds. "Sir, I'm afraid photography isn't permitted at this time." He shrank back. The grace of Eleanor's silence had turned into something magnetic, undeniable. The entire cabin felt it now. The air was different. As the wheels touched down, a murmur rose, a hush of respect, not applause. The kind of silence one reserves for sacred places. Or sacred people. When the plane taxied to the gate, Eleanor stood slowly. Her scarf still wrapped softly around her neck. She turned to Julian and offered a quiet goodbye. As she walked toward the exit, Inez stepped beside her, offering no words, just presence. At the front of the plane, 2 ground staff waited. One held a bouquet of small white orchids, Clara's favorite. The other carried nothing but reverence in his posture. Passengers stood in respectful silence. As Eleanor passed the first row, the same executive who had dismissed her earlier on the tarmac awkwardly bowed his head. She paused. "Your firm once tried to rename the fleet," she said, almost conversationally. Clara's name wasn't negotiable. He looked stricken. Eleanor continued walking. Behind her, Julian wiped his eyes before anyone could see. This wasn't just a twist. It was a return. The glass jet bridge gleamed under the afternoon light as passengers slowly filed out. Most moved quietly now, subdued, as if they had just stepped out of something sacred rather than a flight. Eleanor walked with calm, her steps unhurried. The orchids in her hands rustled faintly with every movement. A few people whispered her name. Some stepped aside instinctively, others simply watched her, their faces softened by something they couldn't name, shame, awe, or perhaps both. Behind her, Julian followed at a distance, his journal pressed against his chest like something holy. The man in the beige suit from the boarding gate stood near the exit, adjusting his tie nervously. As Eleanor passed, he cleared his throat. "Ms. Grace. I didn't know. I mean, if I had known who you were." She paused and turned to face him. Her expression was not cold, but steady. "I understand," she said simply. "That's the point, isn't it? We shouldn't need to know to offer respect." He blinked. Yes. Of course. "Safe travels," she added gently, then turned away, leaving him with his mouth slightly open and his pride a little smaller. At the terminal's far end, near the quiet VIP lounge, a woman in a navy blazer was waiting. She looked young, perhaps early 30s, holding a tablet and scanning the crowd. When she saw Eleanor, her eyes widened. "Ms. Grace? I'm Elise from Skyclara Public Relations. The CEO would like to." Eleanor raised a hand. "Not today, Elise. No press. No meetings." Elise hesitated. "Of course. Understood." Eleanor walked past her without another word. Inez caught up beside her. "They'll be waiting at the car. Shall I escort you?" Eleanor smiled. "Just walk with me." The bustle of the terminal rose around them, footsteps, announcements, rolling luggage, the hum of travel. Yet it all felt far away. Eleanor's thoughts drifted. She remembered the early days. Building the airline from nothing but grief and a dream. The long hours with Robert, sketching out plans on napkins, naming every route after memories of Clara. She remembered being dismissed by banks, laughed at in boardrooms, told that sentiment and aviation didn't mix. But they had built it anyway. Quietly. Thoroughly. And today, not because of a press release or a billboard, but because of a moment of disrespect, the truth had surfaced. As they neared the airport's grand atrium, Eleanor noticed a small boy sitting on the floor beside a suitcase, his face wet with tears. His mother was talking anxiously on the phone, clearly overwhelmed. Eleanor knelt down slowly, setting the orchids aside. "Hey," she said softly. The boy looked up. His eyes were wide and dark, scared but curious. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small silver pin, a tiny pair of wings, the kind given to children who fly for the first time. "My daughter loved these," she whispered, pinning it gently onto his coat. "They're magic. They help you be brave." The boy nodded silently, then offered a small smile. From behind, his mother lowered her phone. "Thank you," she mouthed. Eleanor stood up. "It's nothing," she replied, though her voice caught slightly on the word. They continued on. At the exit, Julian stood off to the side, watching her. He stepped forward as she reached the doors. "I just wanted to say," he began, then stopped. "Actually, I just want to thank you." Eleanor gave him a small nod. "If you write anything, make it about the idea. Not the person." Julian smiled. "The idea that kindness should be instinct, not recognition." She smiled back. "Exactly." The glass doors parted, and cool spring air spilled in. Outside, a black car waited. But Eleanor didn't rush. She turned for one last look at the terminal. So many people rushing in and out. So many chances each day to be decent, or not. Behind the glass, she saw Walter, the same man who had mocked her sweater, dismissed her presence. He stood frozen, briefcase in hand, his eyes meeting hers through the pane. He looked as if he wanted to say something. But there was nothing left to say. Eleanor didn't nod. Didn't wave. She simply turned and walked toward the sunlight, her scarf dancing behind her, the orchids in her hand, and the weight of the day slowly lifting. This wasn't a victory. It was a return to dignity. And that was more than enough. The black car moved gently through the city, its windows catching the reflections of passing trees and morning light. Eleanor leaned back against the leather seat, her fingers tracing the soft edges of the orchid petals in her lap. She wasn't rushing anywhere. Not today. Beside her, Inez sat in quiet companionship, her hands folded politely over her phone but her eyes occasionally drifting toward Eleanor, watching as one might watch a rare book being closed for the last time. The hum of the road beneath them was steady and low. It matched the rhythm of Eleanor's thoughts, calmer now, no longer sharp and tangled, but smooth and unfolding like pages turned with care. "I almost said something cruel," Eleanor said softly, still looking out the window. Inez turned. When he laughed at my sweatshirt," she replied. "I imagined all kinds of lines. Clever. Cutting. Some would have landed perfectly. And yet," Inez offered, "you didn't." Eleanor finally turned her gaze to her assistant. "Do you know why?" Inez shook her head. "Because Clara wouldn't have," she said. Silence followed, gentle and respectful. She had this way of making even rude people sit down and behave, just by being unbothered. When she was 5, someone called her ugly at school. She came home, handed me a flower she'd picked from the playground, and said, "Mom, I think their eyes are broken." Then she ran off to draw butterflies. Inez smiled, a wistful softness in her expression. "Sometimes I wonder," Eleanor continued, "if I'm really building something for her, or just trying to build something that will keep me from collapsing without her." Inez didn't rush to reply. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and sure. "Maybe it's both. Maybe love like that deserves to leave a trail behind." The car slowed. They had arrived. A low, modern building with glass walls stood ahead, Sky Clara Foundation headquarters. Named not for power, not for prestige, but for a girl who once wore rain boots in the sun and believed penguins could fly if you cheered loud enough. Eleanor stepped out, holding the orchids in one hand and her scarf in the other. Inside, the reception staff rose instinctively. Eleanor offered them a nod but didn't pause. Her steps carried her down a long hallway lined with photographs, not of planes, but of people. Nurses, farmers, teachers, students, faces that had been touched by the foundation's work. Their smiles lined the walls like stars. She stopped at one in particular. A young girl with braces and big glasses, her arms wrapped around a cello. Underneath the photo, a plaque read, "Clara's note, music will always find the quiet ones." Eleanor touched the plaque lightly, her thumb resting just under her daughter's name. Behind her, soft footsteps approached. It was Julian, the young journalist from the airport. He looked nervous. "I know I said I wouldn't write about you," he began, "and I won't. But I was wondering, would the foundation be open to a story about the people you help? No names. Just the impact." Eleanor turned, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she nodded. "Write it from the view of someone who never thought they'd be seen," she said. "Because that's who we built this for." He smiled with gratitude and stepped back, sensing that her attention had shifted inward once more. Eleanor moved toward the main hall. The glass ceiling above spilled sunlight like hope, casting long, soft beams across the floor. Near the center stood a bronze sculpture, abstract, beautiful, unmistakably shaped like wings lifting from stone. At its base, a simple inscription. "To Clara. You flew first." She stood there for a long while. And then, a young girl, perhaps 11 or 12, came up beside her. She had short curly hair, wore a Sky Clara badge, and clutched a notepad. "Are you, the lady who started this?" she asked shyly. "I suppose I am," Eleanor answered, turning to her. The girl looked at the sculpture, then back at Eleanor. "It's really pretty. Did you make it for someone?" Eleanor smiled softly. "For someone who made me believe in flight again." The girl grinned. "My mom says your foundation paid for my violin. I never had one before. It's red. And I can almost play Twinkle, Twinkle now without squeaking." Eleanor laughed, an honest, ringing sound. "That's wonderful. I'm gonna be in an orchestra one day," the girl declared. Eleanor bent slightly, meeting her eyes. "Then play it like someone who knows what music can heal." The girl beamed and ran off to join a small tour group gathering by the entrance. Inez returned quietly to Eleanor's side. "She's from Syria. Lost her father in the war. But she writes poems in 3 languages." Eleanor nodded. "Then we didn't just save her future. We borrowed from it." They stood for a moment longer, letting the sunlight wash over them, letting the memories drift in and out without resistance. Then Eleanor turned, walking once more through the space she built from grief, now filled with the echoes of laughter, learning, and lives reborn. She had been judged by a sweatshirt. But she would be remembered for everything beneath it. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the Doha skyline, Eleanor stepped alone into the quietest room of the building. It was small, tucked away beyond the administrative wing, and hardly anyone knew it existed except those who truly belonged. The walls were painted a soft, sea glass green. On one side, a bookshelf lined with Clara's favorite titles, stories of flying creatures, stubborn princesses, and lonely inventors who found magic in broken machines. In the corner stood a child-sized armchair with a fraying edge, left untouched since the day Clara last sat in it. Eleanor placed the fresh orchids in a vase by the window and walked slowly toward the wall where a single photograph hung. It showed Clara, about 9 years old, sitting cross-legged on the floor of the old apartment, holding a model airplane above her head. The name written on the side of the tiny plane, in uneven child handwriting, read, "Sky Clara." Beneath it, a bronze plaque had been newly installed. It read simply, "The girl who taught us that flight begins with dignity." Eleanor rested her palm gently on the edge of the frame, her fingers trembling, not with grief, but with the weight of everything they had built, together. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Behind her, the door creaked open. It was Julian, the young journalist, holding a file in his hands. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said. "You're not," Eleanor replied, still facing the photo. "I found something you might want to see," he said softly. "From 12 years ago. Before the airline. Before the foundation." She turned, curious. He handed her a thin, yellowed application. The logo at the top read, "Orion School of Aviation." The name on the form, typed in small block letters, was Clara Grace. Age, 12. "It's real?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely a whisper. Julian nodded. She applied. "Just a symbolic gesture," they said. But they kept it. Said it was the youngest and boldest thing they'd ever seen. Eleanor sat down slowly. Her eyes scanned the form, every box filled out with a child's earnest handwriting. Under, "Why do you want to fly?" Clara had written. "Because my mom says when your heart is too heavy to walk, the sky can carry you." Tears filled Eleanor's eyes, but they didn't fall. Not this time. Julian watched in silence. After a moment, Eleanor looked up. "Thank you for showing me this." He smiled. "Thank you for making this world possible." As he left the room, Eleanor turned back to the photograph, Clara's smile frozen in time, the model airplane still in her hands, mid-lift. Outside, the city carried on. Planes rose into the sky, their engines humming like lullabies. Somewhere, in a small apartment or hospital room or refugee shelter, a girl with a violin or a book or a simple dream was getting ready to rise, unaware that her first step had already been paved by a woman in a penguin sweatshirt. In that moment, Eleanor finally understood. This had never been about hiding who she was. It was about reminding the world who Clara still is. And with that, she whispered the final words of the story, only meant for her daughter's ears. I didn't build this to remember you, love. I built it so no one would forget what dignity looks like when it learns how to fly. Then she stood, straightened her scarf, and walked out of the room, leaving behind a story that would continue long after the final scene faded to black.